just need to do is get me your grade. If you're taking it for credit, just get me your grade. Get me how many you missed, and if you want to find out what your grade is, there's 35 questions with there being 6 possible answers on the last one, 35. So if you just wanted to add, instead of there being 34, you just add the 6 there and turn that into 40. And so you just divide the 40 by 100, and that's going to be how you would take off a point, how many points to get your final grade. You got that?
That's a lot of math.
Well,
You got a calculator. I got a calculator.
if you can't do it, just let me know how many you missed, and I'll figure it out and let you know what your grade is. Roger gave me the spiritual sword issue for April. If you have access to it, it's lessons from the book of Job, so I'm looking forward to reading that. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the late Franklin Camp, but several years ago, after he passed away, some groups took his notes and created some booklets. Brother Camp was an amazing teacher. Now, the story I heard, Roger, he only preached like for 3 churches, I think, in his entire preaching career, and it was sort of like a rotation deal. He preached at one for many years, went to a second one, preached there, went to a third one, and then he went back to the first one, went to back to the second one, went back to the third one. And so he was doing that. And the story that I heard after he passed, the preacher that came in, what's his name? Do you remember what the big guy?
Bobby Duncan?
Huh?
Bobby Duncan?
Bobby Duncan followed him after he passed. And Brother Duncan asked, I think he's the one that told this story, asked the elders, well, what do you want me to, what would you like for me to teach on? He said, you pretty much teach on anything you want to except the book of Philippians. Brother Kemp's been teaching from that for the last 2 years. And he could do that. I mean, that's how in-depth and studious the man was. An amazing preacher and teacher. And interestingly, he would consider himself to be nothing more than just a country preacher. He was one of the greatest scholars I think the Brotherhood ever had. Do you know who his college roommate was? Willard Collins. Willard Collins, who was the president for many years at Lipscomb. And the joke I always heard about Brother Collins is that Brother Collins only had one sermon, but he could preach it 500 different ways. And so you have a man who rises to the height of academia among the Brotherhood as president of one of our colleges, and then his roommate, just a country preacher. But in my opinion, and I got to hear both of them preach and lecture, Franklin Camp was a superior scholar. He really was. And so if you have access, if you can get this, it would be well worth your having in your library. It's just to study the book of Job. And I'll give you the address. It's called Brothers Inc. Incorporated. Brothers Inc. It's 4207 Veterans Memorial Drive. Veterans Memorial, Memorial Drive and that's in Adamsville, Alabama. Adamsville, Alabama, 35005. 35005. This is it's a very good book study guide. So, pardon? It's Veterans Memorial Drive, 4207. So when we were together the last time, we were looking at the speech of Elihu, and we're going to return to that speech tonight and begin there, and then we'll move into the speech, if you will, that God makes beginning in chapter 38. Elihu claims that Job had been righteous in his own eyes in verse 1. And that he justified himself rather than God in verse 2. This is sort of this part of this chapter it's a very small section of prose, and so it's somewhat of a summary. And then Elihu launches into his speech. I am young. He obviously is younger than the others who are there. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, as well as Job. He's angry at Job, but he's also angry at the three men. And the first chapter seems to be most of his anger in that chapter, or his comments are directed toward the three men. If you look at the reason why his anger is aroused against the three men, you look at verse 3 again in that prose section. Because they found no answer, and yet they condemned Job. They could not, if you look at these speeches as a debate, and I don't know if you ever, a long time ago, I stopped watching anything that was political in the form of debate, because it's not debate. It's nothing to do with whatsoever debate. Were any of you ever involved in high school debate or college debate? Are you familiar with it? There's really a proper way to do a formal debate, and very well the way that this is presented, it very well could be, but what usually happens when an opponent in a debate cannot answer the argument that the other is putting forward. Now, I've got some great debate books from years past from our brethren. I've got some debate books that go all the way back to the Restoration, and I've got books coming up through the ages from that point. And I have even found that in some of those books that I've read over the years, the same thing happens. When somebody who is an opponent and they cannot answer your argument, what do they normally do? They start attacking the person. They start going after the individual. And that's exactly what Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did with regards to Job. They went after him as a person. They attacked him as a man. And so they condemned him, and yet they could not answer his arguments. And you don't have to be. I was in debate and drama and speech. That was sort of one of the areas in my high school that I really gravitated toward. And when I taught for 3 years at Columbia Academy, a Christian school over in Columbia, Tennessee, I taught advanced speech, and part of that course involved debate. And one of the things that I recognized, not only from my reading of a variety of debates, but also from watching them and learning, is you don't even have to understand everything completely from the standpoint of argumentation, and I'm using that term in the formal sense of the debate. You don't have to understand everything from the standpoint of argumentation to recognize when somebody is completely without any kind of accuracy or purpose in their response, except to try to tear down the individual, discredit the person and not the argument. And that happens so frequently. In my opinion, that's what political debate is all about. Political debate is all about tearing down the other person and not having a substantive discussion about policy. And that's why I stopped listening to that a long time ago. Probably one of the best debates that I would recommend if you were interested in that format of discussion, you probably could find it, I'm sure it would be online, would be the Warren Flew debate. It's the Thomas Warren and Anthony Flew debate. Brother Warren was a staunch debater in our brotherhood, and Anthony Flew was I believe, did he call himself an atheist, or he did consider himself to be an atheist? But he basically, right off the bat, throws away any efforts to try to discredit the arguments that Brother Warren was putting forth. So you see here that these men didn't have a leg to stand on in making an argument against Job, and so they attack his person, they attack his character, they go after his integrity, and that perhaps is part of the reason why Job so strenuously maintains his integrity. And so Elihu, in this first part, he goes after them. And he establishes that. He says in verse 10, he says, "Therefore I say, listen to me. I also will declare my opinion. Indeed, I waited for your words. I listened to your reasonings while you searched out what to say. I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job." But it goes beyond that, doesn't it? You not only were unable to convince him, but you couldn't answer his words. You didn't have an answer for him. Lest you say, "We have found wisdom. God will vanquish him, not me. Now he has not directed his words against me, so I will not answer him with your words." And then, beginning in chapter 33, he begins his his argument against Job. His comments against Job. Now, again, he's already given us the basis. The basis of his argument against the three men is you couldn't give him an answer, and yet you condemned him. And so now, in his comments that he directs to Job, we just go back to verses 1 and 2. You're righteous in your own eyes, and you've justified yourself rather than God. But he says, but please, Job, hear my words and listen to all my words. In chapter 33, in verse 1. And then you drop down to verse 8, it says, surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words. Okay, that's in essence the same thing that he says back over in verses 10 to the other three. You know, I have listened, you listen to me now because I'm going to give you my opinion. Verse 11, I waited for your words and I listened to your reasonings. Well, in essence, he's telling Job the same thing. Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words. Now, he puts somewhat of a summary. He makes a declaration here with regards to the argument that he's trying to establish. Job, you've justified yourself rather than God, and you have also been self-righteous. You're righteous in your own eyes. And so look what he says in verse 9. And again, you just note that he's saying, Job, this is what you're saying. He's making a summary there. He says, I am pure without transgression. I am innocent, and there is no iniquity in me. Now, is that what Job is saying? Well, let's just refresh ourselves. If we turn back over to chapter 7, it's part of Job's response there in his response to Eliphaz. You look at chapter 7 and verse 21. Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? Okay? And then just turn over to chapter 13, which was Job's response, part of Job's response to Zophar in the first cycle. And look at verse 26. For you write bitter things against me and make me inherit the iniquities of my youth. So let's establish here that Job is not saying that he has not sinned. Okay? Job's not saying that he's innocent of any transgression. All right? He's not saying that. Now, he is saying that I don't deserve what's happening to me. He is saying that. And he is in essence saying that God has brought these things upon him. You recall the quote that we read last week from Zuck, and in essence the nature of the argument here. We stated that Elihu is right, or he's more correct than the others. All right, and a good summary of his observation, or a good idea with regards to what he's saying, while the other three men, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, says, Job, you're suffering because you have sinned. In essence, Elihu is saying, you're sinning because you've suffered. All right? And part of how Job has sinned is he has tried to justify himself rather than God. Remember, we pointed out if we go all the way back to chapter 1, again, the last verse in chapter 1, in all this Job did not sin nor charge God. And at the conclusion of the scene in chapter 2, in verse 10, in all this Job did not sin with his lips. All right? But as we've already seen repeatedly in his comments to these friends of his, to the statements that they have made, he often turns his attention away from them and he directs his comments to God. You've done this to me. You are mistreating me. If you just remind the key verse and its companion in chapter 19 and verse 6, God has wronged me. He has been wrong in that argument. Sinning because he's suffering. He's not sinning, he's not suffering because he's sinned. But he is sinning because he is suffering. But he's not saying, I'm perfect, I've never sinned. He acknowledges that in those two passages that we looked at. And so, Elihu is not entirely correct to make the assertion there in chapter 33 and verse 9, where Job says, I am pure without transgression. No, that's not what Job is saying there. But he goes on. And so if you start reading with me in verse 12, look, in this you are not righteous, I will answer you. For God is greater than man. Why do you contend with him? For he does not give an account of any of his ways. For God may speak in one way or in another, yet man does not perceive it. Now, we have an Old Testament statement that reminds us that God's ways are what? Not our ways. And his thoughts are not our thoughts. And I'll be honest with you, if I were Job and I were going through this, I just would not be able to comprehend it. I would not be able to know it. Now again, that's Job's comment in those two verses in chapters 1 and chapter 2. You know, what does he say in chapter 1? What does he say there? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so at that juncture, Job obviously still doesn't get it. He still doesn't know it. But he's acknowledging something about the Creator. But as he goes through this, and he's making these arguments with his friends, and then he's turning his attention to God. You've wronged me. This is happening to me without a cause. And again, we have to understand the perspective that Job is coming from. Because Job is, in essence, is of the same idea that his three friends would be. Bad things happen to bad people. I'm not a bad person. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I'm not a bad person. You ever heard people make that statement? We all know people who make that, right? You know? I don't think God, I don't know how many times I've had people in the course of studying with people who say, I don't think God's going to send me to hell because I'm a good person. You know? I've never done this and I've never done that. And you have to teach them, it's not about what you've done or what you've not done. It's about seeing yourself in relationship to God. That really is the heart of it. And that's, again, we'll go ahead and jump ahead. And that's really what's going to bring Job back to reality. It's what's going to bring Job back to reality. It's the example of Luke chapter 5. Remember in that scene where the fisherman had been out all night fishing and he hadn't caught anything? And Jesus says, cast your nets out. And remember what Peter, well, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, but, well, you don't know anything about fishing. We're the fishermen, you're a carpenter. But at your request, we'll do what you say. And then they threw their nets out, and what happened? What was Peter's next comment when he came to shore? Do you remember? Do you remember what did he say? What's his next comment? Lord, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. He has the awakening on that occasion. Okay? Another example is, do you remember Thomas's declaration with regards to, we've seen the Lord, I'll not believe it until, and then what's his statement when the Lord appears to him? My Lord and my God. It's the same as Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. When he's in the throne room of heaven and he sees God and all of the vision, all of this grandeur, and all of this heavenly thing that is going on, what does he say? Boy, I must be somebody because I can see all this. No. Woe is me, for I am undone, for I'm a man of unclean lips. You see, bringing people to Christ, what they have got to see is just how much they need Christ. And they've got to see Him for who He is. And then when they see Him for who He is, you know what they're going to say? Well, I'm a good person. You know? Or, you know, they're not going to say that, they're not going to talk about who they are. They're going to see Him, and when they see Him as He is, they're going to see themselves as they really are. And isn't that what Job does at the end? Exactly. Chapter 38, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? At the end, Job's going to say, it was me. I didn't know what I was talking about. I spoke out of turn. And that was Job's failure. And Elihu, I am convinced, is bringing that up to him and letting him know. You know, that's your big problem, Job. That's your big problem. You think that you can be on the same level with God. You think that you're at the same level with God. Well, look what he says in verse 12 again. For God is greater than man. Folks, when we forget that, when we don't remember that, in every essence of it, if we don't lose sight of that, we'll always remember our place. But Job had somehow forgotten that. In chapter 34, and again, we obviously have to jump around and move quickly because we're dealing with a lot of material here. In chapter 34, Elihu turns his attention to Job's claim that God was unjust. Hear my words, you wise men. Give ear to me, you who have knowledge. For the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose justice for ourselves. Let us know among ourselves what is good. Job has said, I am righteous. But God has taken away my justice. Should I lie concerning my right? My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. What man is like Job, who drinks scorn like water? Who goes in company with the workers of the iniquity and walks with wicked men. For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should delight in God. Think about that for a moment. That Job should claim that there's no benefit to serving God. And again, regrettably, we've got people in the Lord's church who they may give lip service to it, but boy, they're not really convinced of how important it is to serve God. And yes, we serve God when we worship God. That is a way in which we work to serve. But we serve God in so many other ways too. When in the parable of Matthew chapter 25, in the goats and the sheep, you know, when did we see you hungry and not feed you? And when did we see you thirsty and not give you? What's the answer? When you did not do it to the least of one of these, you didn't do it to me. And so, again, it goes back to understanding who we are in relationship to God. In March, in March, after we had decided that we were going to be suspending services, and I wasn't going to the building as frequently, just simply because I didn't want anybody to come to the building, you know. And so I picked up a bunch of stuff and I took home with me, and I'd been doing it. And I read a fascinating little book that was given to me. And it's got a green cover, and it's called The Salvation of God. Does anyone have that? The author is right over there. Excellent. And so for the last several weeks, I've been preaching on grace, the grace of salvation. And Roger's book benefited me tremendously as I was reading through it and using my Bible and looking at things. And one of the points that I made just this past Sunday was the appreciation of, and this past Sunday I did salvation by grace involves obedience. And one of the things that I've tried to emphasize, and I talked about the Garden of Eden. I simply started talking about the Garden of Eden. And think about it from the standpoint of the graciousness of God, even before sin came into the world. Man was created in the image of God. Man was given dominion over all the other creation. Man was given a garden to live in. And everything they needed in the garden was there. And there was only one prohibitive rule. Don't eat that tree. Don't eat from that tree. That was it. And so we see God's grace present in all of those things. And again, the thought is, and the idea is, that I was trying to convey, is the minute we think that we can act and that we can behave in a way that is contrary to God, then we lose that which we need from God more than anything. And that's His abiding grace, His abiding presence. in our lives. They had the graciousness of God. And all they had to do is stay away from that fruit. But if we think that by doing things so as to demonstrate our submission to His will makes us worthy of His grace, we do not understand the graciousness of God. Oh, well, we don't even get God. We don't understand God. We don't understand Him. Grace is most powerful when we understand that I have died to self. It's another thing. It's interesting the way death and grace are talked about. You ever thought about it from that standpoint? Paul starts Ephesians chapter 2 by saying what? You were dead in your trespasses. Hey, listen. Remember the movie, the silly movie, The Princess Bride? You remember? And you remember the argument is, well, he's only partly dead. Or he's mostly dead. I think it's mostly dead. You know, when you're dead, there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing. Nothing you can do about it. You're dead. And yet, the grace of God makes us alive in Christ Jesus. Spiritually, we understand it. But He uses the dead. And then when we think about grace and obedience, we understand that what do we have to do? Well, Romans chapter 6 teaches us that we die to ourselves, don't we? And we die to ourselves and we're raised up what? In newness of life. Paul put it like this in Galatians 2:20, I've been crucified for Christ, nevertheless I live, yet what?
Not I, but Christ.
Christ lives in me. That's the grace of God. That is the epitome of God's grace. And so it's about me deciding that I'm not going to choose my selfish ways. I'm going to do His will. Again, we go back to Job. Job had it right. In all this, Job sinned nor did charge God foolishly. But later on, he starts charging God foolishly in his suffering. But one of the great lessons of Job is to teach us how to properly respond to suffering. And things to stay away from and mindsets to avoid when we are in the throes of suffering. We can learn that from Job. But God, being unjust in His afflictions, this is the heart of what He is saying here. Verse 10, Elihu, therefore listen to me, you men of understanding, far be it from God to do wickedness, and from the Almighty to commit iniquity. For He repays man according to his work, and He makes a man to find reward according to his way. Surely God will never do wickedly, nor will the Almighty pervert justice. I would underscore the second part there of verse 12 as being a very key statement in chapter 34. Now, we're moving on into chapter 25, where Elihu condemns self-righteousness. That's how it's, in my Bible, that's the little heading that I get above that chapter. What New Testament group that we are introduced to when we began reading in the Gospels were the purveyors of self-righteousness. scribes and the Pharisees. You remember the prayer, the parable of the sinner and the Pharisee that Jesus prayed? Remember the prayer, the Pharisee seeing the sinner afar said, I'm glad I'm not like that man. Verse 2, Elihu says, do you think this is right? Do you say my righteousness is more than God's? For you say, what advantage will it be to you? What profit shall I have more than if I had sinned? I will answer you and your companions with you. Look to the heavens and see, and behold the clouds. They are higher than you. If you sin, what do you accomplish against him? Or if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness affects a man such as you, and your righteousness a son of man. Folks, Paul quoting from the Psalms in Romans 3 says, there is none righteous, no, not one. In other words, we have no righteousness in and of ourselves. Our righteousness is totally and completely reliant upon our relationship with God through Christ. There's the grace of God again. My only hope for righteousness is found in Him. And so then I ought to want to have my footsteps follow Him. I want to live my life to His glory. Not for the purpose of thinking, because if I do that, I deserve something. But because I understand that in and of myself, like Isaiah said, I'm undone. Like Peter said, I'm a sinner. Like Thomas declared, my Lord and my God. We began to recognize and see Him for who He is. And when I see Him for who He is, then I see myself for who I am and how much I need Him in my life. Man, what a blessing that is. And you know what that ought to help me do? Because Job is not so much being self-righteous here in his comparison with others. He's just making a case that he's righteous and that all of these things that are happening to him are not fair. It's not fair. These things ought not to be happening to me. So that's his stand of self-righteousness. Job might say, you know, I made all of those sacrifices. I didn't just make sacrifices for myself. I made them for my children. I made all of those sacrifices. I did all of the things that I was supposed to do. That's the case that he's made. But once we understand our relationship to God, that should also prevent us from thinking ourselves as being righteous and seeing the unrighteousness in others. And I think that's a greater problem of self-righteousness. Because see, I can look at somebody else and I can think myself to be better than them or more righteous than them or more qualified than them. And the minute I start seeing them and I start comparing myself with them, then I've taken my eyes off the one through whom my righteousness comes. The one through whom I depend upon for my own righteousness. Job had never lost sight of who God was and who he was. He got lost in his suffering. You're doing this to me. Think about his arguments about wanting to talk with God. If I could only find him and sit down and reason with him, and he would come to see it my way. That's what Job has been saying. He just got it out of whack. And so Elihu is right here in the things that he says. Just two passages that are important. And it's a prelude. This is a prelude, and I think this is interesting. If you look back at verse 35 in chapter 34, what does Elihu say? Job speaks without knowledge. Look what he says at the conclusion of chapter 35. He multiplies words without knowledge. Sound familiar? Turn over to chapter 38, when the Lord speaks. Who is this, verse 2, who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? So Elihu was on to something, because God uses some of the same words that Elihu had used right here as he begins to show Job, you've lost sight of who I am, and I'm going to remind you of just who I am. So we'll finish that up next week.